So for section C, discuss the problems associated with the enforcement of international law, and you must make reference to state sovereignty. Now that question is being very, very generous, okay? The fact that we've given you that in brackets, just really focus on state sovereignty, is saying one thing about international law. That is the main argument, okay, about international law. The one thing that was done well in this, and I actually said this to the other class, and I'll say it to you guys as well, this section C was done better than section B, okay, which is quite good. Section C is the higher order thinking. You can actually work that out from looking at the directive terms. Outline is essentially that sort of middle order thinking. Something like define, identify is the lower base of, order of thinking, okay? But once you start getting into discuss, assess, to what extent, the big one in legal studies is evaluate, okay? They become harder questions. Now, one thing that was done really well with this section C was the definition of state sovereignty. Whilst some people had this very general terms definition, a lot of you had a really good definition for state sovereignty, but you need to go further than that. The one thing about state sovereignty, well, there's two things that are very important. First of all, state sovereignty can protect international law. It can recognise it and ratify it into a domestic nation-state's law system. I'll give you an example. You guys are actually doing one right now, the right to education. How is that right being protected? Okay, well, the Australian government has made legislation and has made a system to protect that right. Okay? And that's all under the sovereignty of Australia. So state sovereignty can be good. The question, though, is asking you for the problems, okay, with the enforcement of international law. So you need to go into that, how state sovereignty impedes certain problems around the world. You also needed to go into examples, and some really good examples that was used was obviously Rwanda. One thing you've got to be careful with Rwanda is you've got to spell it correctly, okay? So the first thing that I saw was people not spelling it properly, okay? Rwanda. It doesn't have an A there, okay? So one thing I want people to work on, if you can see this in your own writing, is quite simply legal terminology, okay? You've got to get the legal terminology right so you can impress the marker, okay? Now, if you don't have that legal terminology, it's not feeling like a legal paper, okay? And when we get to year 12, the things that we need to have in an essay that is a must, okay, when we look at this thing called a rubric, is it says legal terminology must be used and have an understanding of it, okay? So you need to use things like that. The really good section C done by students here to get up into the 5 and 6 mark was you're applying it to the actual operations from section B. So a lot of people were using the Security Council's lack of response in, say, something like Rwanda, okay, or the General Assembly's use in the Ukraine crisis at the moment, okay, with their sort of development of a resolution to say that the takeover of Crimea was illegal. You've got to sort of bring that in and make it into your response. There are 3 major things that you need to focus on here in section C. Of course, state sovereignty. Okay, the question's giving that to you, so you must do something with that, but you've got to take it further and apply it, okay? The second one was one that we talked about a lot when we were watching Rwanda, and that was the lack of political will, okay? And what that's talking about is the governments out that were involved in that issue, okay, had a lack of response. And why? What was the reasons why they didn't respond? Say something like Rwanda. Well, there was a whole problem about genocide, okay, whether it was genocide or not. There was the whole issue of it being an intrastate conflict in a country in Africa, and so therefore, was there any economic or political interest in this country? Okay. You also had problems with events that had occurred before Rwanda, okay, with the Somalian crisis, and that largely affected America's political will to intervene. Okay, so you've really needed to focus on that one to boost your marks in this section. You also needed to look at the lack of enforceability. okay, and give reasons why it's difficult to enforce international law. So, the fact that the peacekeeping forces are ad hoc, they're set up for the occasion. We don't have that permanent army to go out there and enforce international law every time. You need to connect that argument with state sovereignty and how some nation states deny sort of entrance into their country when there's a civil war breaking out, that kind of thing. All right, so these three things are important. And guess what? In Year 12, we're just marking world order essays, and that argument doesn't change. Okay? You just have to connect it to that question you're doing it at that time. But these things here, they are very important to international law. And when we get into essay structure and arguing in an essay, for international law, these are three big areas. Okay? We go deeper, obviously, but we can base an argument around these three big things for international law. Okay? Any questions?